Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, John from the MSP. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 11th of July 2023. Sorry it's a little bit delayed and sorry that my voice is a little bit echoey as the electrician is in and I'm in my kitchen. It's a game of two halves really. The northern Luhansk, even into Kharkiv Oblast, in terms of around here near Svatova, around here near Kreminna, and then further to the south near Bakhmut in terms of Spurna. There appeared to be some Russian gains and possibly some up near Kupiansk as well. When we come further to the south, Bakhmut is looking good for the Ukrainians, and there's not a lot of detail coming out about Velika Novosilka, a little bit more about Robotina, and some about Pyatikhatki over here, not a lot about the Antonivsky Bridge. So let's go and see what's happening in this northern area. As you can see, some gains as per Andrew Perpetua's mapping. The Andrew Perpetua pro-Ukrainian mapper line here, the blue line signifies Russian defensive lines and the red line signifies Russian defensive lines as per Syriac maps. So you can see that there's a big difference up here. Let's go to and it's interesting to note the ISW says that the Ukrainian army has liberated the same amount of territory in 5 weeks that the Russian army has captured over 6 months, right? So someone is asking, is that definitely true? Yes. However, when you look at some of the gains the Russians have made in the last couple of days, you wonder whether that still remains the case. But overall, Ukrainians have made more gains in a month than the Russians did in 6 months. And so Russian claims that it's all going so slow and it's a failure is nonsense, but it is obviously difficult. Right, the ISW says of the area, geolocated footage published on July the 9th indicates that Russian Storm Z assault detachments made marginal gains within Novosilivska. We'll come and look at that in a second. They claim that Russians claim that they repelled Ukrainian attacks there, which is interesting considering Ukrainians are on the defensive there, I think. Russian bloggers claim that Russian forces advanced south of Vilshana. Now, I haven't seen any evidence of this, but it's worth noting that Tim White says, I wouldn't normally include this propaganda in the thread, but it's the second instance in successive days showing Russia now admits to wanting to control far more of Ukraine in the 5 regions. This includes Kharkiv, where Kupiansk is situated. So he's going to talk about Kupiansk in general, but this may fall into confirming the claims about Vilshana that we saw in the ISW. So TASS, the Russian news agency, reports over the past few days, Russian servicemen have made significant progress in the direction of the city of Kupiansk. He noted so Russian Lieutenant Colonel notes that the advance of Russian forces is forcing the, quote, Ukrainian occupation authorities, which is massively insulting, as if the Ukrainians are occupying their own land, to evacuate state institutions and businessmen, turn off their businesses and move to Western Ukraine. So that is a potential movement for the Russians in Vilshana area, but I don't really know. What there definitely seems to be movement around is the place of Novosilivska, just to the west of Kuzymivka. So Kuzymivka is a small town to the northwest of Svatova, and we have Russian gains all along this sector, from the north of Kuzymivka right down past Kolomoychika to almost Zhirelne. So yeah, Andrew Perpetua shows these changes. Syriac maps indicated some Russian gains yesterday, moving into Novosilivska. Andrew Perpetua showed it as grey zone, but he's increased his Russian control to over the railway line to the road now. Novosilivska is uphill above Kuzymivka. Previously, I mean, it has changed a number of times, Novosilivska, but the Ukrainians have been solidly there recently for the last few months and have been trying to take Kuzymivka, have moved into the outskirts of Kuzymivka, while the Russians have certainly pushed them back, as according to these sources. We have some geolocated evidence. Now, this is evidence to show that the Ukrainians have repelled Russian attacks, taking out 18 Russians here, repelling Storm Z assault groups. A company of Russians was destroyed thanks to the concerted actions of Brimstone Beskentniks and artillery and of the International Legion. This has been geolocated to here. We'll plug that in, see where that shows that there is Russian activity. And that is pretty much right in the middle of, the area between Kuzymivka and Novosilivska. Then more of that footage is evaluated here, and there's another geolocation given, which I think, if I remember, is pretty much in the same kind of place. Yep, so that is activity taking place between Kuzmivka and Novoselivska, where the Ukrainians are claiming to have taken out, or there's evidence to suggest that they have indeed taken out Russian attackers. But that doesn't mean that the Russians haven't made gains. And if we come further down south, there's quite a number of fields that Andrew Perpetua is saying the Russians have made gains in, certainly around the Kolomoychika area. And this is I suppose, in opposition to the idea that the Ukrainians are making gains along the lines that we have seen from the 30th of May. So if I go back to here and show you another line, I'm going to show you a white line, which is a deep state map line of Russian defenses from the 30th of May. So this is just before the counteroffensive started. You can see the Russians have actually made gains in the Kupiansk area around Sinkivka. There's some bit of chaos going on around Pusha Travneve, not quite sure where the lines are and who to believe here. And as well, north of Kuzmivka, the whole area here, Andrew Perpetua has under either the grey zone, but the Russian defensive line is a lot further back than, say, Syriac maps. When it comes to the Kuzmivka area, there seems to be some agreement that there is gains for the Russians there, and you can see gains past the 30th of May line. Now, as we come further down south, so that is not looking great for the Ukrainians. The question is, here and around Kreminna, what is the objective? What are the objectives of the Russians here? Are they trying to take territory because there's intrinsic value to this territory? Or is this a case of, and I think that this is more reasonable, that the Russians are trying to throw a spanner into the counteroffensive works to make the Ukrainians think twice about what they're doing, to have to relocate resources and fix Ukrainian troops in these areas rather than, execute the counteroffensive according to their own plans. It's making the Ukrainians adjust their plans. Right, as we come further to the south, we come to the Kreminna sector, where there are gains for both mappers for the Russians. So we can see that all along the salient to the west and to the south, the Russians have made gains, and you can see that where that sits in line with the 30th of May line. I'm going to get rid of that just to give us a bit of clarity for the time being, but that will return. So if we go back to the ISW, here we have so unspecified positions captured near Kuzmivka. Russian MOD claim that they repelled Ukrainian attacks near Kherson, so that's between here, where we are now, and Kuzmivka, and Dubrova. So the claim is that the Ukrainians are attacking near Dubrova, but it is supposedly where the Russians have taken territory. A Russian mail blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted successful offensive operations near Torska and south of Kreminna in the Serebrenska forest. Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces conducted unsuccessful attacks west of Spurno, and we'll come on to that. So it does seem like the Russians have been successful in this area towards Torska. In fact, we have some geolocated footage to suggest that, and this is what Null Reports refers to here. So this is the update for them, that there are some gains around the Torska area. A video from the 23rd Battalion shows how Russian forces were targeted at Torska. The footage is 3 days old, but can be assumed that the area is at least contested. This means that the zone of Russian control, or grey zone, is further towards Torska and expanded. Well, actually, this footage of Russians being attacked is quite a bit to the west of the front line. So actually, they are attacking well within Ukrainian territory, controlled territory here, and really within the kind of urban environs of Torska. So that is a bit of a concern for the Ukrainians, no doubt. As we come out of here, we see the mention in the ISW that Spurna is mentioned, and indeed, this is where before we get there, it's interesting that Rebar, the pro-Russian source, doesn't mention anything until we get to northern Bakhmut. So they're not mentioning any of this, even though this is really very positive for the Russians. And as you can see, Andrew Perpetua's map shows that the gains are made around Dubrova and Torska are fairly significant. There's also a lot of activity around Sperna, but they don't, or Andrew Perpetua doesn't show any gains there for the Russians. On the other hand, as we come down here, we pass Bilohorivka, we come to Sperna. On the other hand, Suryat maps does show gains for the Russians in this area. So if we go to Suryat maps, we can see that there are gains to the south of Sperna for the Russians, and indeed gains to oh no, that's in the Serebransky forest. It's all a bit out of order for them in this update. But there gains to the north of Sperna. So the other day, Tim White was saying that the Ukrainians were surrounding the Russians in Sperna. I think at the time I thought he got that wrong, because this seems to have been bubbling over for some time, and I think really it was the Ukrainians being surrounded in Sperna, because the Russians weren't in Sperna. The Ukrainians control most of Sperna, but I think they are somewhat surrounded by the Russians at the moment. So that is another troubling area for the Ukrainians. It'd be interesting to see where that goes. There's some talk that someone was saying in my threads today that the more the Russians extend themselves on a thin salient here, the weaker they are to being attacked on the flanks and cut off. So that could be the silver lining to the Ukrainian cloud there, but it is certainly something that they are going to need to come to terms with. And then we move on to this Solidar area, where the Ukrainians seem to be having a lot more success than the Russians. So if we there's Sperna there, we come down to now Rozdalivka in the north. I'm going to get rid of this group of tabs. Now, in the Bakhmut area, if we go to Andrew Perpetua, we can see on his map that there are consolidated gains for the Ukrainians in the north there by Vesele, but down south from Rozdalivka. Although there's no changes to the Russian lines there, it is just consolidating gains made in the grey zone. Attacking then just along the M03 highway there, the E40 highway, and the Russians then attacking further to the south, interestingly. Bakhmut here, both sides trying to make gains, and then much more success for the Ukrainians down near Klishchivka and Kurdyamivka, and indeed apparently also in Bakhmut itself. So there's a lot of talk about Bakhmut and what's going on. Let's go to the ISW. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister reported that Ukrainian forces established fire control over Bakhmut itself and made unspecified advances south of Bakhmut. That would be towards Klishchivka and perhaps Kurdyamivka. Ukrainian Force Commander Sursky also told ABC News in an interview, and he would say this, published on July 9th, that he's confident Ukrainian forces will retake Bakhmut. If we go to Suryat maps, now this is, I think, a couple of days old now. So situation north of Solidar, video footage shows recent Ukrainian counterattack in which troops broke through the first line of Russian defense in this axis and took control over a series of positions just north of Yakovlivka. Now, this was shown on both Andrew Perpetua and Deep State map, actually, which is in the yellow in the Bakhmut area. So that's another pro-Ukrainian mapper. They showed this gain a couple of days ago. Indeed, Deep State caught up with that, I think, yesterday, and they've got a 48-hour operational security delay plus. But Andrew Perpetua showed that 2 or 3 days ago. I think Suryat Maps is finally catching up there. They haven't caught up south here, where this is today. Deep State have changed their mapping here to show some gains to the Ukrainians south of Rozdalivka. Andrew Perpetua already had that. Suryat Maps has not shown that yet, but I think that will be the case. And I think there is this, onward pressure of an initiative and momentum for the Ukrainians in this northern sector. That puts pressure on these smaller settlements like Sakio, Vanseti, and Mykolaiivka there that are possibly going to get sort of flanked or attacks from various sides. If we go on to look at some of the other sources, this came out just today. Today I published video evidence of Ukrainians fighting inside the city of Bakhmut. This is P-Star 11, probably hit and run tactics. Now there are news that Ukrainians are fighting within the boundaries of Klishchivka in South Bakhmut and continue to advance in north by Bakhmut. So we'll come on to look at these. Another source saying for several days now, the defenders have been keeping the entrances, exits, and movement of the enemy around the city under fire control. Earlier, General Sursky reported that the Russians were trapped near Bakhmut, and Malyar, Deputy Defense Minister, said the Ukrainians control the main dominant heights around Bakhmut. What that means is that they are claiming the Russians can't get supplies in and out of Bakhmut particularly easily, and a lot of these surrounding towns as well. That everywhere is under fire control, and that the Ukrainians are fighting in Bakhivka, fighting in Klishchivka, and in Bakhmut as well. Here, Rozdalivka, the northern area we've already talked about, Ukrainians advance in the direction of Solidar to the south and southeast of the village of Rozdalivka, taking control over a number of strongholds. The Russian troops in the villages of Mikhailivka and Sakho-Vanseti got into a fire bag. I don't know quite what that means. It could mean that they are kind of surrounded, as I was mentioning, in certain areas that are being fired on from sort of multiple sides. As you can see there, if Andrew Perpetua is correct, then they're getting attacked from several flanks in Mikhailovka and Sakho Vanseti. So that would make sense of that. If we carry on to our next source, here we have evidence that Ukrainians are fighting within Bakhmut in the city limits. This could well be just on the very edge, southwest and western outskirts for sure, and there could be hit and runs taking place, but it does show you that Russia are continuing to lose control over elements of Bakhmut city as well as the surroundings. Now, there was I reported on how Akhmat, the Chechen fighters, have been drafted in to help shore up the Russian defenses in Bakhmut. Or Kadyrov soldiers from the Akhmat regiment who rushed to the aid of the Russian units that were retreating little by little were defeated at the entrance to Bakhmut. And the actual message says the agent Atesh, so these are partisans, pro-Ukrainian partisans, from the composition of the armed forces of the Russian Federation reports that the Kadyrovites were defeated in the vicinity of the city ruin of Bakhmut, dozens of dead and wounded. They run from the positions, worse than Mobiks. Together with them, the military, the 83rd Separate Assault Brigades and 57th and 72nd Separate Motorized Rifle Brigades are dying en masse. So the Russians are dying in large numbers is the claim. Being in foreign detachments and sending Russians to meet assaults, they fell like the masters of the Russian Federation, but now everything has changed. Felt like, sorry. The Ukrainian Defense Forces took the city under fire control, and a denouement will happen very soon. That's a claim there. Defmon says about the fire control, he says, I believe it's kind of correct. They do have fire control, but it's going to be more of a problem, not for the Russian forces in Bakhmut, but in the outlying towns and villages, really. And that it could mean they'd have issue with evacuating injured soldiers, particularly. So places like Klishchivka, Kurdyivka, Ozeryanivka, Sakho-Vanseti, Yakovlivka, and Zalizhnyansky, all of these kind of little settlements, they'll have serious fire control, the Ukrainians, over those, and that will inhibit the Russians from moving and resupplying their troops. The claim, although there's no mapping changes, there is supposedly consolidation of Ukrainian gained ground in this area and apparently fighting in Klishchivka. We also have the idea that the Ukrainians are forcing their way down on the eastern side of the canal, down towards Kurdyivka, and there is some gains that the Ukrainians made over the last couple of days across the canal by Kurdyivka. There's also, as Andrew Perpetua's map shows, pressure around Kurdyivka from certain angles as well, and Ozeryanivka too. So Ozeryanivka just here. So the Ukrainians are attacking both to the north and also to the southeast, to attacking Ozeryanivka, where we heard that there was an armored attack the other day. So there's a lot of activity going on in the Bakhmut area. That's all kind of confirmed by the ISW there, pretty much, although it will be somewhat out of date because the update gets done, yesterday evening, and a lot has happened since then. So good news for the Ukrainians around Bakhmut. Not too sure about those other areas to the north where the Russians seem to be making some gains. Then we come to Adiivka. There's not a lot of information coming out of Adiivka. The usual places mentioned: Novokolonove, Stepova. The Rebar says, the pro-Russian source says that the Russians have put the Ukrainians one supply route into Adiivka under fire control. Now, I don't quite understand this because they haven't made any particular moves anywhere. They aren't any closer. I think it would have been under fire control anyway, if it is under fire control. So I don't understand why is that sudden change. Activity taking place in all the usual culprits: Opitny, Vodyany, Pervomaysky, Nevelsky. and then up in Novokonyovo, Krasnohorivka, and this Vasile area. Now, reporting from Ukraine talks about how I reported yesterday on that mechanized attack that involved 21 vehicles. Reporting from Ukraine was saying that I think it kind of implied that they lost almost all the vehicles or loads of them, but there's still, I think, only evidence that maybe 8 or 9 vehicles of them were definitely taken out. I'm not quite sure how much of a failed attack that was, but that kind of coincided with them apparently taking some land there. So it was at least nominally successful, but at what cost? And I think, you know, um, reporting from Ukraine in their video was indicating that it was quite a cost to the Russians. But other than that, not a great amount of detail from the ISW. So we'll move on and we'll come down now past Marinka, where there's still activity, past Novomakhivka, where there's still activity, past Vuhledar, don't know what's going on there, and across to really still in Donetsk Oblast to Staromorska, Pryutne, and so on and so forth. And really, not a lot of detail is coming out of anything around here. I'm sure there's heavy fighting, and there may well be advances. There's just not much from open source sources. If we go to the ISW, they talk about troops active around Pryutne, but still talking about sabotage and reconnaissance groups rather than full large-scale attacks. And then, yeah, not too much to say. Staromorska or Staromayorska and Uruzhane still mentioned. All the normal places that we've seen for the last week there, activity taking place in those settlements and attacking those settlements. But yeah, not a lot of detail outside of that. So we'll move on to past Drozhnyanka and Myrna, past well, actually up to Novopokrovka, which is the first place we're going to talk about before we talk about Robotna, where there's a lot of activity and a lot of bandwidth is being spent discussing that. Now, to mention the settlement of Novopokrovka, this might well be from the 9th of June, so a good couple of days old. Here is a Ukrainian attack in that area. We will. Oops, no, I haven't copied that. We'll put this into Google Maps and see where that indicates. And it is actually to the west of Novopokrovka. If that is from the 9th of June, that's what we'd expect. There was some movement around that time of the map to further to the east, as far, if I remember, as far as Andrew Perpetua is concerned. It looks like both the mappers agree there. Just to give you a sense as well, actually, no, I'll do that at the end. So, yeah, there's some evidence that there is fighting taking place near there, perhaps even in the settlement or very close to it at the moment. And then we come on to Robotna. The first thing to say about Robotna, I guess, is, well, to have a look at where the larger trench lines are. So if we look at Robotna here, and goodness me, once you get past these, you've still got 2, 3, 4, and then Tokmak, 5 lines of large trenches. But I think the Ukrainians have overcome this first line here, and there's claims that they've done that both east and west of Robotna. Don't know that for sure. What there is a lot of claim is of a loss of some Bradleys and a tank in doing so. And of course, that's going to happen. What it tells us more importantly is where the Ukrainians are at. So this is one source saying of the area for the last day, the loss of the enemy in killed and wounded amounted to more than 2 companies. 17 units of enemy military equipment were destroyed. 9 enemy ammunition depots were also destroyed in this direction. No report says footage emerged of AFU units attacking just east of Robotna, confirming their presence close to the settlement. The attack with losses is likely from the 6th or 7th. So not only that, but this is 5 days old. This footage is just coming out, and lots of people are talking about today and yesterday. Fighting is occurring directly on both flanks of Robotna. Grey zone slightly increased to the south. So if we come on to War Mapper, I think actually the grey zone is probably further to the south here. And arguably, this line of trenches has been overcome and may well have been overcome to the west as Well, per Russian sources, Ukrainian forces up to a platoon from the 47th Brigade with fire support from Bradley's launched an attack on the Russian positions near Robotna. The Russian sources. During the battle, the Ukrainians managed to penetrate Russian defenses to the depth of 400 meters. Also, so remember, yesterday Russians reported that they had raised the main trench to the ground in certain places as well, with heavy artillery and rocket attacks. That's really significant. So the geolocation of the lost Bradleys and tank, which the Russians will be talking about a lot and trying to big up their achievements there, but that's always going to happen when you're attacking, right? And it's not hugely significant numbers of equipment, is just to the northeast of Robotna there, pretty much where I'm sure that first line of major trenches is at. So I think they have lost vehicles at that point. Andrew Perpetua says, don't read into what he's saying too much, but the last time Russia posted a bunch of videos of Bradleys being destroyed is because Ukraine had advanced like 3 times further than they'd thought Ukraine would, and they slow rolled the news of the Ukraine's losses of the Ukraine's advance for a month. I'm not saying that this happened this time, I'm just saying what happened last time. Also, the areas being talked about, these Bradleys were destroyed. He noted, Andrew Perpetua noted signs of heavy fighting 5 days ago. So the argument is that actually they would have advanced past there by now, and that being that large trench line. So some additional info here. Losses are part of war, but by comparison, the last time the Russians repeatedly showed footage of destroyed Bradleys and Leopards near Malotokmachka, the Ukrainians advanced way deeper than Russians initially said. This area holds the first Russian prepared lines of defense. More footage of Bradley's IFVs engaging on Russian positions with combined arms initiative going on there, and so on and so forth. So I would surmise that the Russians have lost some positions around Robotna that could be. I'm sure there's another geolocation. It could be an indication that they have they've lost some of their trench lines there, which would be really, really significant. Yeah, here it is. It's no reports saying that here the Bradleys getting lost around Robotna. So this is, let's see if that is a particularly different place to the pin we've already got. And yes, that is actually quite significant there. So that is movement forward, and that's right on the Andrew Perpetua lines, which would suggest that, especially since that was possibly 5 days ago, the Ukrainians are going to be much further south, and that is in line with the top of Robotna, like the actual settlement there. So we go back to here. That's the top of Robotna. Is that below where those trench lines are? I don't know. It's difficult to tell, but I think you will have seen successes for the Ukrainians in that area. I don't know if it's at huge cost. I mean, it might be that, or it might just be just a number of vehicles, what you would kind of expect if you're assaulting Russian dug-in positions. Right, now we're going to move. So we're going to come out of Robotna, take off the 3D element there, just to pop in to see what ISW have to say. Geolocated footage posted on the 9th shows that Ukrainian forces have advanced southeast of Oroki, which I've shown you, towards Novopokrovka. Russian mill bloggers additionally claim that Ukrainian troops conducted limited reconnaissance and force attacks with a group of 30 personnel along the Pyatikhatki-Zarabyanki line, and some Russian forces claiming that Russian forces operating near there deliberately abandoned trenches and then booby-trapped them. I've already shown you that was 2 days ago. So that's coming out of Robotna, where we'd expect to see some mapping changes fairly soon, and come into Pyatikhatki. There is just one bit of data here. 2 Russians deciding to go for a walkabout and getting hammered by artillery, which is to say Russians are getting hammered in this position. Geolocated, where you'd expect them behind their lines, being hit by Ukrainian artillery. Nothing unusual there. So still a bit of a stalemate, it seems, around the Pyatikhatki area, which must be frustrating for the Ukrainians as they need to move past Zarabyanki to get towards Vasilivka. But at the same time, they're not really committing huge amounts of forces, which suggests then that they are still in this attritional phase where they're still just knocking out Russian depots behind the lines, and are happy to do that because it will degrade the Russian capability in defending these lines. Last thing I'm going to say, well, just very quickly, no change around Kherson in the Antonivsky Bridge area. The ISW does make some Kherson claims here, saying Russian forces conducted air, missile, and artillery strikes against the west bank of Kherson Oblast and Mykolaiv Oblast. So that is to the west of Kherson. As we come out of here, you can see there's a dotted line there. That leads into from Kherson Oblast into Mykolaiv Oblast, and there is a city of Mykolaiv on the Bug River. So we have Ukraine's Southern Operational Command stated yesterday that the Russians conducted 60 artillery strikes with 365 shells, so they're pretty much pummeling the Dnipro against settlements and Ukrainian positions on the West Bank, and conducted 3 KAB laser-guided bomb strikes against Berislav Rayon. So Berislav is the other side of Novokakhovka near the dam here. You can see it there. That is often hit by these guided bombs, these glide bombs, FAB or KAB glide bombs. That Orikhiv is being hit here from the Kimburn Spit. So this is an area where they used to train the Marines. I think there's still military establishments there, and that often gets pummeled by Russian artillery, and it's kind of game of cat and mouse in this whole area of chasing the Russian artillery and trying to do counter battery fire against them. And that there is evidence that that the Russians are using drones to hit targets around the Antonivsky Bridge. So although the Ukrainians have been claimed to have electronic warfare advantage in the area, the Russians are still able to use at least some of their drones to do certain duties. And that's pretty much that. The only other thing I will say is that there's a lot of news coming out from the NATO meeting in Vilnius. So Germany have promised a whole bunch of equipment that looks really, really high value. Norway have promised, they've now pledged, gone up from like 230 million to $900 million, I think. Huge increase. France have promised Scalp-ER. So we'd heard that they had before, but there's no evidence of that. So these are Storm Shadow equivalents. Now, France are piling in with some Storm Shadow equivalents. That means that Ukraine can really carry on using these Storm Shadows with kind of wild abandon, at least for the time being. That is really significant, and I'm sure more and more stuff will come out of that over the day, over today and tomorrow. So I'll keep you posted. That's what's going on. It really is an interesting mix of activity. A very different story to the north of Bakhmut as one to at Bakhmut and to the south. So I'll keep my eyes on it, keep you posted. In the meantime, thank you so much for your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.